Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Political Vigilante. I am in one of my glamorous road studios here at a wonderful hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's great to have back on the show RT reporter Caleb Maupin, who has a new book called City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. He's going to tell us all about this. Caleb, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm excellent. So yeah, Ron Placone and I are in Vegas. We have a show here tomorrow night, the 27th. But I'm glad you reached out to me because you have this new book out, as I said, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. And it's really, it's amazing to me because you go through sort of, you go in the history. I mean, you talk about the death of Julius Caesar and imperialism and the crisis of Marxism. And then you kind of take us all the way into today and where we're at. So explain like how you came to decide to write this book and what it could bring to an audience like this. We have a lot of left-leaning progressives that watch my show. We have a lot of socialists that watch my show. So tell us, walk us through your book and what it's saying.
Well, it's interesting. I showed this book to a lot of friends of mine, friends that are, politically close to where I'm at as a leftist, folks that are maybe far away from me, and they all said it surprised them. They were expecting just a typical, book saying we ought to tax corporations more and kind of the contents of a Michael Moore movie. And they said, you blew me away. You're talking about mythology. You're talking about ancient history. This is quite a unique approach. And there's a reason I did that, which is that I feel like a lot of this 20th century vocabulary that people use and a lot of the assumptions that kind of underlie political debate in the United States are not really sufficient for what we're dealing with in the United States right now. And that if we dig deeper into politics and we start looking at the history of all humanity and human civilizations, we go back to Rome, we go back to Greece, we go back to the civilization that has existed in China for 5,000 years, when we dig into that, we can get to some real answers about the crisis we are facing in the country right now, the underlying essence of which is economic. I mean, the standard of living is dropping, and Donald Trump says it's an economic miracle in the United States right now. Well, it's not an economic miracle in my neighborhood. It's not an economic miracle in the neighborhood of a lot of people who are watching this right now. Just because Wall Street can be making lots of profits doesn't mean life for average Americans is getting better.
Well, it's an economic miracle for CEOs, Caleb. They're having record profits. The 1%, it's their parade. It's amazing. The way the media spins it, because they're obviously just propaganda for the ruling class to just say it's so great. And I'm like, where is it so great? I travel across the country doing the progressive comedy with Ron Placone, and I'm like, is this where it's great? Where there's all these out-of-work businesses? Is this where it's so great? Where there's people working 2 or 3 jobs and every Lyft driver is working 16 hours a day? Like, where is this?
Sure, and it's not just simply a matter of a lower standard of living and the good-paying industrial jobs being replaced by these lower-paying service sector jobs. That's just scratching the surface, right? The fact is that in a number of U.S. states right now, they have municipalities that don't have enough money to maintain paved roads. They actually have this device they call a reclaimer, and what it does is it pulls up the asphalt from roads, pulverizes it, and makes it into gravel. And all across the country, in places like Vermont, in places like Alabama, they are replacing paved roads with dirt roads. That's a big economic problem. And you put that in the context of water not being properly purified, you put that in the context of bridges not being secure, we have an overall problem of just the economic foundations of this country are being swept out from under us. I mean, this is a society-wide problem that really needs to be addressed. And, in the book, I talk somewhat about mythology. And I think mythology is very important. And, people think about ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Hercules and all of that. But, if you say to any American, faster than a speeding bullet, faster than a locomotive, look up at the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. We all know that, right? And if you look at that Superman story, that first published in 1939 was the first Superman comic book, right? And I'll tell you, if Americans can love Superman, then Americans can love socialism. Superman's first first action adventure, one of the first comic books, was rescuing a group of striking miners who were being, endangered by their crooked boss, right? And he was defending the Union, right? During the Second World War, Superman actually fought the Ku Klux Klan on the radio. He fought against the Klan, and he said the Klan are preaching racism and trying to divide the country, and the Nazis are the enemy. If you look at those early Superman comics, he's always playing up the idea that the Soviet Union is our ally against the fascists and the Nazis. And actually, Superman was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s because they thought there were communist overtones in the Superman comics. And actually, do you know what the phrase "man of steel" is in Russian? Do you know how to say "man of steel" in Russian? Stalin, right? And that wasn't an accident. Right? That was 1939 that those comics were published, and the Communist Party and the Socialist Party were considered a big part of the Roosevelt coalition that at that point was creating Social Security and unemployment insurance. And in the final years of his life, Roosevelt even called for a new Bill of Rights to guarantee Americans the right to health care, the right to an education, the right to employment. So the influence of socialism and Marxism in the American spirit is very deep. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. Donald Trump says if you're a socialist, you should leave the country, you don't belong here. Well, it was Francis Bellamy, who was a Baptist minister in Boston, whose sermons were so anti-capitalist and revolutionary. He's the guy who actually wrote the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. Socialism has been in the United States from the beginning, right? We, the American people, have a deep socialistic side to us. And I think that gets overlooked, and the right wing has really hijacked all things that are American. And that's very dangerous. I don't think they should be able to get away with that.
Well, it's a great point. You bring up a lot of great points, which is, I did a video about how Smedley Butler, who wrote, War is a Racket, talked about in 1933, a bunch of capitalists came to him to try to have a coup to overthrow FDR because FDR was hurting their bottom line. And it's amazing. You talk about, I'm a huge comic book fan, but I didn't know that about the originals, Man of Steel and the superhero and the action comics that he was defending. And it brings up an excellent point, which is, Chris Hedges talks about this in Death of the Liberal Class in terms of there's art used to be political, it used to be social, and it should talk about the themes of working people and what they're going through. And there's nothing wrong with frivolous entertainment, but if that's the only thing that's available, then it's a destructive thing. So I want to get into this with your book because you did a great job of going into the history of it, and then the Superman is just one part of the history. How did you see doing all of this historical research, going back as far as the Romans and the Greeks up to today? Because I'm so glad you did that, because Americans' history goes back about 8 years typically at best. Like Americans just have no historical reference to anything. Even everyone talks about how great it was in the 50s. Well, the 50s, we had the highest union membership, we had the highest tax rate, we had the highest banking regulation, and that's when we had all this upward mobility. And I don't think Americans realize that. And that's part of it, is the propaganda machine has done a great job of misinforming Americans. So we're not taught about Smedley Butler. I didn't learn about Fred Hampton. I grew up in Chicago. I didn't learn about him till a year ago, which is a crime. So walk us through why and what you learned from the history and you say the mythology, and how that's gotten us to this sort of really toxic lake stage capitalism that is really dismantling not just America but the world.
Well, for the majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. That's the overwhelming majority of human history. We were in tribes of 20 to 30 people in the woods hunting and gathering. But eventually we got too good at it. Right? With our creativity and our brilliance, we were making spears to kill those animals. We were paying attention to the patterns in plant growth. So pretty soon there wasn't enough fruits and nuts to gather. There weren't enough animals. So we had to start domesticating animals and growing crops. And that was the beginning of civilization, right? Is when we broke out of the hunter-gatherer stage and moved toward agriculture. And that was the origin of private property. And that was the beginning of class society. And, there was the slave system that we saw with Greece and Rome that eventually gave birth to feudalism. And the terms left and right come out of the struggle to bring down feudalism. In France, after the French Revolution, after they toppled the king, they set up a national assembly. And the ones that were the most radical and revolutionary, they sat on the left. And it was those who were loyal to the king and wanted to preserve the old system, they sat on the right. And after a while, those who sat on the left started calling themselves the innovators, because that's what it meant to be left. It meant you were trying to innovate and come up with new ideas. And that's when left-wing people call themselves progressive. That's generally what the term means. And that's the origin of the terms left and right. It's the left is associated with historical progress and trying to advance, trying to get to a new stage with more social justice, more equality, a higher standard of living for the human race, whereas the right is associated with preserving the old and preserving what is there and tradition and hierarchies and such, right? And that's the difference between left and right as it's generally been understood. But during the late years of the Cold War, things got very, very confused, as I'm sure you're aware. And I get into that in the book. And now, there are a lot of people that are left, for example, that think that we ought to go back to some kind of primitive hunter-gatherer civilization. Right. And there's a lot of people on the right who are very excited about technology, and it's very confusing, right? And that the political compass that kind of guided us through the Cold War, it has been broken. And especially this Russiagate stuff, where the Democrats are saying to Trump, oh, you're a traitor, you're working for the Russians. That has really thrown everything for a loop. And what does it mean to be left? What does it mean to be right in the 21st century? That's what I get into in the book, because it's not as clear as it once was.
So that's really good, because you're right. It's so been watered down to what left and right means. And now, people on the left are pushing for war. This country has been in this never-ending state of war. The people who call themselves left are like, why is Trump trying to make peace? I'm not a fan of Trump at all, but when he talks to another nuclear power about, disarmament, I'm in favor of that, because World War III will kill all of us.
Sure.
So I'm looking at, there's a section you have in here like petro-socialism in Scotland. That sounds intriguing to me. I don't know what that means. Tell me what that chapter is.
Well, there's a big movement for Scottish independence. There was a referendum that almost passed for Scottish independence. And there are a lot of Scottish people that want to break out of the United Kingdom. And now, in particular, now with Brexit, there's a lot of Scottish people who want to stay in the European Union, so they want to leave the UK so they can stay in the EU. But underlying all of that is the fact that the majority of the oil and natural gas in Britain is in Scotland, right? And that right now that's under the control of London corporations like BP. But if Scotland were to declare its independence, then who got the natural gas would be up for renegotiation. And the Scottish National Party and a lot of the folks there feel like it should be nationalized. It should go into the public budget. And that's what's underlying that. And the Scottish people, more of them are in labor unions. College is still free in Scotland. It's not free in other parts of the UK, but it's still free in Scotland. And when it comes to economic issues, the Scottish people tend to be pretty far to the left of the average UK voter. And that's underlying it. And in the age of austerity and budget cuts, the Scottish people are saying, hey, why should London have the right to tell us we can't give people free health care? Why should we be taking budget cuts in our national health care service, for example? And that's underlying it. But the big issue is oil and gas. That's really what's driving a lot of it. And also another big issue, though, I will add, in addition to the oil and gas, is the fact that the nuclear weapons of the UK are in Scotland, the Trident program. And a lot of the Scottish people don't feel comfortable with that. They say, why are there nuclear weapons in our backyard? We don't like that. And the public opinion in Scotland is opposed to it, but yet the nukes are there because that's what the UK Parliament in London wants. So that's underlying that. And the economic component to the Scottish independence question, I think, needs to be addressed. Often media just makes it sound like, oh, Scotland's got a unique culture, they wear kilts and watch some Braveheart, they want freedom, they're kind of missing the point. They're not understanding this is an economic question.
Well, that's so interesting. It's really fascinating. I didn't know those things about Scotland. This is why I do love doing this show, is I learn about things that I wasn't aware of, and when we learn about how other countries are doing it, it always, for me at least, gives us ideas, because we're so told, how are you going to pay for that? Or that's too crazy of an idea. And it's like, no, they're already doing it, or they have done it, or they're it's already been done. It's not that crazy. We're told it's crazy here because the ruling class wants us to think that it's, nobody ever asks how we're going to pay for this war or that war or this bomber or that. But nobody ever asks how we're going to pay for that. They always ask how we're going to pay for things that we need. And obviously, as we're facing, complete climate collapse, and the fossil fuel industry is like doubling down on drilling and pipelines and more war. What you're talking about with Scotland is interesting, but I think it all sort of relates. Obviously, you have a chapter in here called American Deep State Flops in Iran, where obviously every day there's some new false flag that comes up. They're trying to get us into war there so bad because Iran, doesn't want to give us their resources. And they have the audacity of putting a country above American oil and putting their country. How dare they put a country in the middle of all of our military bases? I mean, it's just like... So explain that part of the book and how it relates to what's unfolding in Iran right now.
Well, the crazy thing about it is Trump has made it more obvious than any other president in U.S. history what this is really about, right? He says, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, sure, they killed journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Sure, they cut people's heads off in public, the only country in the world that still does that. Sure, they torture. Sure, they're bombing Yemen and killing lots of people. But we get lots of their oil, we sell them lots of weapons, and it's about money, so who cares? That's basically Trump's attitude, and he's spelling it out, not trying to dress it up as anything else. And when it comes to Iran, he's doing the same thing. He says the United States policy now is to bring Iranian oil exports down to zero. That's Mike Pompeo has stated that. Well, here's the thing. Every barrel of oil that Iran sells, anyone should know, is a barrel of oil that somebody didn't buy from us or from some, country that is basically in our pocket like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Kuwait. So it's about pushing them off the market. And especially in the last few months, it's gotten really explicit. We're seizing oil tankers, right? In Gibraltar, the British seized an oil tanker. It's about pushing a country that was once a vassal state, right? They had the Shah, a brutal dictator who let BP and the Rockefellers with what's now ExxonMobil, but the Standard Oil before, run their oil. Now instead of being, a vassal outpost of American and British oil companies, Iran is instead, at this point, it is a competitor on the international markets. And the idea is to push them off as a competitor. And the crazy thing is, if you look at many of the geopolitical enemies of the United States around the world, right, Iraq, prior to being invaded, was a country that was competing with Wall Street and London on the oil market, selling oil, right? Libya, before being bombed and destroyed and reduced to rubble and chaos, was an oil-producing state that was competing with Wall Street and London on the oil markets. Venezuela, Russia in particular. Russia is one of the leading oil and natural gas producers in the world. So if you look at it, very much these countries that are targeted are competitors. I mean, at this point, the oil markets are cornered by Wall Street. If you take Total, which is the French corporation, and you add to it, the four super majors in the United States, BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Royal Dutch Shell, those five companies control 88% of the world's oil production. 88%, right? And that is what is keeping us on fossil fuels. Because if we get off of fossil fuels, that will overturn the global order. That'll be the end of Wall Street and London being at the center of the world economy. Because they corner the oil markets. They've got all the oil markets, whether it's Nigeria, South America, the Middle East, the oil fields of Louisiana and Texas. They've got them all cornered. So if we get off of oil, like we desperately need to do because of climate change, if we get off of oil, that means reshuffling the deck on who's on top of the world economy. And that's something they're very afraid of doing. Now, what I think is interesting is that, the oil markets in the United States, you have the fracking companies. And they tend to be a lot more supportive of Trump, right? They see the big four super majors as their competitor, as trying to, push them off the market. They tend to be more supportive of Donald Trump. Whereas the big four super majors tend to lean a little more liberal, right? And whereas, the fracking companies will just deny global warming. Say, hey, global warming doesn't exist. It snowed last week. Look, it can't be global warming. The big four super majors will say, well, actually, you're right. Global warming is real. So therefore, all these developing countries, they just have to stop developing because, look, I mean, Russia, they got to stop selling oil. Venezuela, they got to stop selling oil. And, we got to stop building infrastructure around the world. Hey, global warming, guys, we'll just quit. We'll stop now. We're on top of the world. And that's their attitude. And Malthusianism, this notion there are just too many people in the world, right? The problem is there are just too many people. I think that's very dangerous. And I think that the answer to global warming is scientific progress. The answer to global warming is we need more We need more. We need to get beyond fossil fuels. We need fusion energy more than anything. We need new fuel sources. We need alternative energy to not just mean, solar panels and windmills. I mean, it's got to mean something more powerful and more explosive than that, something that can get us out of this trap of the oil-based economy, which keeps, a few Western bankers on top of the world and keeps the world poor, essentially. Right? That's what the South China Sea is about, by the way. There's all this talk about the South China Sea. What is China doing in the South China Sea? China is not an oil-producing country, right? It's dependent on foreign oil imports, right? And most of their oil comes via oil tankers in the South China Sea. So they have militarized the South China Sea in order to make sure that at no point is there like a blockade or anything that's set up to block their oil tankers from coming in there. And China realizes that's a real vulnerability that they have. They're able to get some oil via a pipeline from Russia. But most of their oil comes via the South China Sea, and it's a vulnerability. That's also why they've been working with the government of Nicaragua to build an alternative canal to the Panama Canal, right? Because the United States, in theory, in some kind of military confrontation, we could cut off the Panama Canal, and then any oil tanker that was coming through there wouldn't be able to get to China, right? So, the idea is also they want to have an alternative to the Panama Canal, in coordination with the Sandinista government, which is a Marxist leftist government that is friendly to them. And so that's going on as well. So if you look at the global economy, people want to make it all about Trump's personality and North Korea, it's crazy rocket man and all this. You got to look beyond the personalities and look at the economic base and look who's making money and who's struggling to develop and what countries are struggling for markets and who's selling what product. I think that's a way people can learn to look at things.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, it's always great to see the realities of how things are done. I didn't realize that about China and the South China Sea, but it does make sense. And I totally agree. What we need when I talk about wanting like a Green New Deal is part of it would be money spent on research to come up with some sort of clean burning. I mean, obviously, wind turbines and solar panels. Sure, we could just put money into that right now. That'd be fine. We could do that across the country in a year. But like the long term of finding some sort of renewable fusion or whatever that would be, I think you get you put money and research into the best brains on the planet, they would come up with stuff. Maybe somebody they're getting close, but they're in a lab and they need more. I don't know what, but there's a bunch of ideas we didn't anticipate, we didn't even know existed. Like when I started as a stand-up comic, when I was 18, YouTube did not exist. That the internet did not exist. And now I'm making a large portion of my living doing this. So there's somebody out there who can come up with some sort of technology that could literally get us out of this, but it better happen soon because we're running out of time.
Yeah, but instead we have all our smart people figuring out derivative rip-off schemes on Wall Street.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the scary thing about our global economy now, and particularly our U.S. economy, is that as the standard of living goes down, as things like drug addiction increase, all the Wall Street corporations have figured out ways to turn that into making money, right? You talk about the prison industrial complex. You talk about what's going on with the opioid epidemic and how they were purposely pushing doctors to overprescribe opioids. I mean, this is amazing. As the country's falling to wreck, the corporations are saying, okay, well, we can make money off of this somehow, Well, you think about Roosevelt. What made Roosevelt such a beloved leader was the fact that he built infrastructure. Yeah. There were millions of unemployed people in the United States. He put them in bright green uniforms, and he sent them out to go and build things like the Hoover Dam and build like Key West Highway and JFK Airport here in New York City. And he laid the foundations of what eventually became a strong economy in the post-war years, right? The rest of the world had been blown up by the Second World War. We had this huge, layer of infrastructure that had been built by the Roosevelt administration, and that created a boom. And that's the 1950s that people talk about. It was a glowing time because the USA was selling steel and aluminum and cars to the entire world because the rest of the world had been pretty much blown up and destroyed by a war. And we had a huge infrastructure base on which to base that economy. So I think when people talk about the 50s, they're kind of missing the point. They talk about social conservatism, they talk about anti-communism. They're kind of missing the point. There was an economic foundation to that, and I think that in addition to that, there's a lot of pessimism in the United States right now on the left and the right. And it's almost like, when you listen to political leaders talk, they have competing nightmares, right? The right wing says, oh my God, immigrants are going to come in here and rape and murder and kill, so we got to build a big giant wall. And the left says, oh my God, the world's going to explode from global warming and we're all going to die and Trump is a Nazi and he's going to put us all in death camps. And everyone gets afraid, right? And it's fear. And fear is not a rational emotion. You cannot think rationally when you're terrified. Nobody can, right? I mean, when you're afraid, you either follow the leader or you act crazily, right? That's fear. And when political leaders are trying to induce us into a state of fear, they're trying to manipulate us and put something over on us. And optimism, what political leaders should be doing is coming to us and saying, we have a vision. This is how we can make the country better. This is how we can solve our problems. This is how we can move forward and move ahead. That's what should be presented. And if you look throughout history, we talk about the role of the artist, for example, as we discussed before. In every society in history, the artist is considered one of the most important people because the artist has the responsibility for creating the culture that the broad masses of society consume. And the artist generally was considered to have a great responsibility because the artist was supposed to make the public better. People were supposed to listen to the artist or to be doing it. But now with mass marketing, it's the opposite. Now it's almost like artists are encouraged to dumb down and lower the quality of their art to make it mass marketable. I talk about gross, grotesqueness, right? It seems like everything that was beautiful in cinema has been replaced with gross, right? Instead of making a very scary horror film, very full of suspense, they make a movie that grosses you out with blood and gore. And instead of making a really clever joke that just makes you laugh, they gross you out with some explicit sexual comment or something really edgy and you're kind of laughing because you're grossed out, right? Action. Instead of making a really exciting story, what's going to happen next? Instead we got, limbs being chopped off and blood and gore. And that grossness has come to replace the beauty that defines art. And it's really kind of disturbing. But the reason for that is to create real beauty in art requires a risk. It requires a risk. You have to take a risk to take real beauty. And, the investor wants a guaranteed return on the investment. Right? There's a chance somebody could do something really beautiful, but the public just won't be into it, and then he'll lose his money, right? So that's why Hollywood makes the same movie over and over and over again, because the guaranteed return on the profits, right? This drive for profits is ruining our culture in many ways.
Yeah, it's a great point. As somebody that's, I've worked in Hollywood for over 20 years, and, when people talk about the corporate media, I always say, and that extends to entertainment. I've seen it. I've made 2 documentaries, one of them about going to tell jokes in Afghanistan, and, another one about podcasting, and they did okay, but the main work that was offered to me was like hosting game shows and that kind of stuff, and it's the same thing, and you're told as an artist, if you try to be edgy, making a decision 2.5 years ago to start doing this show and become a political comedian, I had to realize I was giving up certain work. 2 years ago, I lost work with traditional media because of my Twitter feed was too political. And I wasn't like swearing or all caps. I was just calling out corporate Democrats in the California State Senate that just voted down single-payer health care in 2017. And I lost work for that. So you're told, and you see who's on as a comedian, you see who's on late night TV, you see who gets the Netflix specials. It's not Lee Camp and Jimmy Dore and people like that. It's you can have a couple of Trump jokes in your act, but you can't call out the system that allowed Trump to happen. You can't call out the war machine. You can't call out the fact that Rachel Maddow does a segment about Russia that is literally sponsored by Boeing. You can't do that in corporate media. So it's everything you're talking about. It's all by design. The 5 or 6 multinational conglomerates that own all of media, they also own all comedy. They own, there's all of it. There's a massive company that owns, 32 improvs across the country. And so everything is filtered through them, and you're told, just be silly. Just do the dick joke. Don't do the political joke. Don't do the socialism joke. Do the joke about your relationship and getting laid or whatever else. That's, Stephen Colbert, they tell comedians, you don't be political on that show.
Wow.
I mean,
Crazy.
It's insane. So it's like I'm so glad that you're bringing this up, and it's important because, like you say, through and again, Americans and then people, we've been so conditioned in America. They're like, oh, don't be so political. Like it's a bad thing. It's a taboo thing to be too political. Oh, it just causes problems. And it's like, no, art was supposed to be. It's been political for centuries.
Sure. Well, and in some cases, it's not even indirect. There's a whole history. It's been revealed now about the Pentagon and the military sponsoring Hollywood movies that have a political message that they like. So it's not even just the military contractors like Boeing, like you were talking about. In some cases, it's actually the military itself. And we know about Project Mockingbird that the CIA had trying to influence the media. That's been well documented and exposed, and that they portray American mainstream media and mainstream Hollywood as if it has no political agenda. But Hollywood has always been political. What was the first full-length movie? It was The Birth of a Nation. It was a racist propaganda film basically created by the Woodrow Wilson administration, right? Because a lot of the Midwestern farm rural folks were Republicans coming out of the Lincoln time, and he wanted them to vote for Democrats, so he made a racist propaganda film that was back at the time of Jim Crow, calling out the Republicans for being the party that freed African Americans, and it was an awful, awful racist film. That was the first big movie, the first full-length movie in the history of the world that was made. D.W. Griffith, 1914. And Hollywood has always been deeply political, and it's interesting. And in my book, I talk about there was this big controversy when there was a Chinese billionaire who tried to buy one of the big 7 Hollywood studios, and the courts actually eventually stepped in to stop him. But it is well understood now that China is the biggest movie market in the world. There's more people going to the movies there than any other country in the world. And that's having an influence on Hollywood. And there were even congressional hearings to discuss this, right? And the Chinese audiences have very different tastes than American audiences. And the President Xi Jinping of the Communist Party of China, he even gave a speech about the importance of art and movie and cinema and influencing culture. And that issue, people want to portray it as if it's all just, communist totalitarianism, but I think that there's a stronger critique of the way we make art and cinema in the West. I think that's underlying it. And I think that I go over that debate and some of the stuff that was said in American media during that time. Hollywood, you can't call Hollywood right-wing. It certainly isn't that, right? It's socially very liberal. It always has been. It's always been pushing the social liberal norms, but it also tends to be very pro-capitalist, right? Glorifying wealth, glorifying selfishness, So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's very socially liberal, but on economic issues, it's very, very free market and libertarian. So
Yeah, Hollywood, look, is tries to get on the right side of social issues, and oftentimes it does. But let's be honest. It's run by wealthy, primarily white neoliberals who consider themselves left-leaning on social issues, but they're not for workers' rights. They have Latinos cleaning their homes for $9 an hour in their Malibu and their Bel Air homes. They drive these egregious luxury cars, and they think they're for the people. They have a coexist sticker, on their Prius or something like that. And I live in Hollywood and I see it, and I don't see them. I'm big brother to a kid who, has family that lives in South Central. And when I go to South Central, I don't see yoga studios and Trader Joe's and Pilates and Reiki healing. And I see check cashing. I see liquor stores. I see fast food. I see zero, healthy organic grocery stores, and it's so Hollywood is just, they're the left side of the ruling elite's coin. In my opinion, I don't see socially they think they're so liberal, but I don't know. Push comes to shove.
Ayn Rand came out of Hollywood. Let's not forget that. Ayn Rand, the philosopher, who her writing is just opposed to any sense of morality. Right? She has a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. She literally argued that altruism and compassion were character flaws that needed to be, bred out of the human race. This is, Atlas Shrugged and that kind of thing. She has one novel, The Fountainhead, where the hero, Howard Rourke, breaks into the apartment of a woman and violently rapes her. And the novel portrays this as if this is somehow a heroic act. This is sick, psychopathic stuff that Ayn Rand put out there. and you would think, okay, this is just a crazy novelist, right? She was a screenwriter in Hollywood for a while, and then she started writing novels. Well, she was the protege of Alan Greenspan. That's what people forget. Alan Greenspan was running the Federal Reserve. He was arguably one of the most powerful non-elected officials in the United States. This is a guy who, like, lived with Ayn Rand, practically, right? I mean, this is Ayn Rand, like, when he first got sworn in by Gerald Ford to his first government job, Ayn Rand went with him to the White House to get her picture taken at the swearing-in ceremony. And so you read Ayn Rand's writing, glorifying rape, advocating that poor people be basically allowed to just die on the street, saying that big business is the most oppressed minority. You read that stuff, that thinking was running the economy for decades, right? That's, in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, people are saying, how could this have happened? How did this happen? Well, it's because our economy was being run by libertarian, objectivist Ayn Rand thinking for so long, and pretty soon there's going to be a fallout, right?
Yeah, it's insane, too, and you see, like, in the 60s when the artists started to, have a social conscience and talk about things, then the capitalists and the ruling class or the deep state, CIA, whatever you want to call it, comes in, divides them. That's when I think every time then, the original hippies were activists, man. They were agitators. And then, now it's all just about sex and drugs. I think that was very deliberate to sort of distract. Anyway, we could talk about this for hours. But look, man, I really appreciate your book. And, any closing thoughts here, and then tell people where they can go get it.
You can get it on Amazon, Lulu. It's widely available. Go to your local bookstore and ask them for it. And I'm getting interesting responses. A lot of topics covered in the book. A lot of different things. But and I think people should check it out. I think they'll enjoy it. I really do. So, city builders and vandals in our age.
Well, Caleb Maupin, thank you so much for being on the show. And then, where can people follow you online and see some of your other work?
You can just visit my website, calebmaupin.com, CALEBMAUPIN.com.
All right.
That's me.
Thanks for being on the show. And thanks for watching.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate you reaching out, and congrats on the book. And everybody out there watching, like, subscribe, share. All my tour dates are at grahamelwood.com. Thanks for watching.
Sure.